70 weeks of years are decreed concerning your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint the most holy place. Know, therefore, and understand that from the going forth of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who will come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary.
That was a bit heavy compared to our normal guest introductions. Now you're Daniel, but are you speaking from the 5th century BC or the 2nd century BC? Could you help us, please?
Well, that will be a part of the discussion of this episode, which is all about the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. Was it a 6th century prophet that wrote the visions of the book of Daniel, or was it somebody or more than one person in the mid 2nd century BC? That is the big question today on this episode.
Great. So welcome to Doubtsaloud, everyone. It is sort of Andrew's show, and we will, Francis and I will be asking him questions and extracting what he knows about the book of Daniel.
Well, yeah, I wanted to do this for some time on the book of Daniel because, it would be very interesting to get both of your points of view, Ed from within the church and Francis from essentially outside of the Protestant church anyway.
Yes, and not knowing a lot about Daniel.
Yes, and so this is very interesting. But it is actually, I mean, if you just have to go onto YouTube and type in Daniel's 70 weeks, for example, because there's a particular part of Daniel that's fascinating.
And that was the bit you read out.
That's the bit I read out, was Daniel. That was Daniel 9:24. Now, when I was young, I picked up a lot about the book of Daniel because it seemed to be talked about by people that were quite fascinated in the end of the age. It's very much like Daniel is like the Old Testament's version of book of Revelation. So in this,
we think that actually Daniel was part of the kind of birth of that whole genre of literature.
That's right. And it's called apocalyptic literature, which is quite different from other prophetic kind of literature in the Old Testament and the Bible generally. There's a particular pattern to it. There's themes that are going on, and Revelation and Daniel, if you just read parts of both of them, you'll think, oh, this is quite similar. And it is. It forms part of the apocalyptic literature tradition, which is basically something that flowered in ironically, and we'll get to this later, in the 2nd century BC. And even though there's elements, it doesn't just spring out of nowhere. There's elements of apocalyptic in certain parts of the Old Testament, Zechariah and some other parts that have apocalyptic sort of tones, and we're moving in that direction. But when we get to apocalyptic, there's an awful lot of angels bringing messages and visions that sort of talk about things that are about to happen in symbols. That's apocalyptic, some themes of apocalyptic. So, Francis, what's your sort of backdrop on the book of Revelation, say, just in a general sense, and Daniel, if you were familiar with it, that kind of literature?
Blimey, I'm not familiar with either, to be honest.
Okay.
I know that Revelation's got 666, the number of the beast, and the beast has been variously interpreted as different things. Am I right in thinking that Daniel makes a prediction about Tyre and about it being eradicated, or am I thinking of another?
You are thinking of Ezekiel.
Oh, okay, right.
And that's a famous one for, was it a failure or not of a prophecy? So that's another interesting one for another time.
Okay, we'll save that for another time.
Yes, another time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that tells you how little I know. I didn't even know that it wasn't Daniel who made the prediction in air quotes about Tyre. But
there's a form I've sent you. If you can sign up for the Daniel course, here it is.
Oh, right. Okay. And how much of my hard-earned money will you be wanting for that?
Well, this one's free.
Oh, really?
Yes,
okay.
that's right.
Well, that might be interesting.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So
you'll have insights and know the date of the end of the age
by the end.
Yeah.
Yes.
Will I?
So,
Oh, well, that's worth knowing.
that's right. So the reason why this has proved quite fascinating, and I mentioned to Ed at some point before about Catholics and Eastern Orthodox generally have a sort of a much more removed stance towards the end times compared with Protestants, and particularly sort of, it's very vocal and fundamentalist Protestants are sometimes all about the end times and the end of the age and the apocalypse and the end of the world and what we call the rapture and all that sort of stuff. It's actually less so in those other mainstream churches, and I think probably for historical reasons. Maybe people just overkilled it and cried wolf too many times, that there's not that sort of interest. But certainly in Protestant churches, go on YouTube, type in the end of the age, the rapture, Daniel will come up, Revelation will come up. It always seems to be something that's about to happen soon in our time, despite that we've been here before talking about soon 2000 years ago. That was in our other episodes. So it's difficult to know where to start with the book of Daniel. So Ed, what do you think we should really sort of kick off with the book for our listeners?
Well, let's grasp there's two big things I want to talk about. One is the influence it's had, but let's start with actually, is it a fraud? Which is another way of saying, was it written when it purports to be written in the 5th century, or was it written in the 2nd century? And this is important because there's an awful lot of prediction. If it was done in the 5th century, there's a lot of prediction of events that are reasonably accurate, getting more and more accurate the nearer you are to the mid 2nd century BC. That's
right. And well, I mean, for starters, the traditional Christian sort of view of looking at the book of Daniel, and I'm saying Christian, not Jewish point of view, because that would be different again, who continue to look at the book of Daniel very differently than the Christian. But the Christian one has pretty much until the rise of sort of biblical criticism, I suppose in the last 200 years, has always been what you call a Christocentric view. Sort of it's all alluding, these prophecies, to the end of the age to do with Jesus, and it's been read that way, so much so that, again, if you typed in on YouTube Daniel's 70 weeks, for example, you would be hard pressed to find anything other than it talking about Jesus, that the prophecies are trying to take you down to the time of Rome and Jesus' crucifixion and the kingdom coming in some sense then. But also about the end of the age, which would still be in our future. That's quite common, the most common view that you'd find in all of this sort of talk. So that's generally the Christian way of looking at this text when it comes to Daniel's visions of the future in symbolic terms. But in the rise of biblical sort of studies of texts and ancient literature, it was apart from one or two people in history like Porphyry back in the 3rd century, who noticed some interesting things that is actually agreed upon by the critical scholars today, that actually this Porphyry guy noticed that, well, this looks like it's all too good to be true for the mid 2nd century in the details. It's so accurate. But then it fails miserably just after that. And then it's quite vague in the early parts of Daniel. So this led some people even then to have doubts about Daniel being an actual 6th century guy called Daniel who was given absolute details 400 years ahead, focusing on 10 years, particularly in the 2nd century. It's kind of a crazy thing to think about in one sense from the outside. But in studies of other literature, there's a famous one called the Uric Prophecy, and it's very similar to Daniel. It has visions of the future and kings coming and going, and it's very accurate. And yet, in its ultimate vision of the end of the age, it doesn't happen. And so people have looked at the Uric Prophecy and said, well, we think it's kind of written at the time after these events are talked about in this Uric Prophecy. And suddenly when it fails, you can pretty well date when it's written. That kind of idea in historical scholarship has been looked at the book of Daniel. And so in that way, it's seen that, oh, there's a pattern here, and there's other literature that does it. When you have specifically detailed events that line up with incredible amount of extra biblical sources that verify it, you tend to be a little cynical and go, oh, maybe the writer then of Daniel was somebody in the middle of the 2nd century just about, who has seen these events, written them down in symbolic form, and cast it as a prophecy from the 6th century, but it's actually history, but cast as the future. So that's where most critical scholars, historical scholars, including some Christian evangelical ones, they accept that actually the prophecies, at least the latter part of Daniel, these visional prophecies, were written in the 2nd century and not 400 years before. So any comments from both of you on that?
Well, I think that is some fairly standard view of how supposed prophecies work, that they're incredibly accurate until you get to the time of when they're written, and then as the writer actually tries to predict the future, it all becomes very vague, and it's then becomes very generalized. Is that something that you see in Daniel, that there's a bit where it's suddenly like, and all sorts of terrible things will happen, but it will all turn out okay?
Yeah, well, more precisely right and more precisely wrong than that. That's what's unusual about Daniel, and that's what's there's so many arguments to argue for a cumulative case for a 2nd century, at least compilation but writing of the latter part of Daniel, because it's split into 2 kind of sections: old stories about Daniel in the 3rd person, and then visions purported to be by Daniel. And it's those visions that are purported to be by Daniel are the ones really focusing on the 2nd century for most of the part. But then it goes on to predict the death of one of the kings, and that didn't happen historically at all in the same way that it was so accurate just before. So again, this is the big thing, and it isn't to do with what's common. The common objection is, and I've heard it many times, it's like, oh, you have an anti-supernatural bias against prophecy, and therefore you need to seek a way to get it to not really show you that, because otherwise it shows that God is real and prophecy is true and you're a sinner. That's the have you ever heard that, Ed?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's and they would say that. Another point is that Daniel isn't that accurate about events that in the time that it's supposed to be set.
That's right. Another hint, by the way, again with the Uric prophecy, I believe it's the same thing, that the further back you go, it's more hazy and not wrong with with corroborating extra stuff in history doesn't work. Suddenly, it's so accurate at this point that it's actually talking about in this predictive so-called prophecy. It's so accurate with external corroborating evidence that you then raises the question, why if you have got foreknowledge and supernatural stuff is going on, the book of Daniel should be just as accurate in the same way that it is in the 2nd century prophetic part. Why be all hazy and wrong with all the extra biblical correspondence in early Daniel? I'll give you an example. Daniel talks about a figure called Darius the Mede. Now, there is with apparently extensive records of all the sort of kings that were going on with Babylon and Persia and everything else. There is no record of someone called Darius the Mede in history except in Daniel. And that is a British shock because
so this isn't just an argument from silence. It's that we know who was king and ruler of Babylon at that time, and it wasn't Darius the Mede, because there was no such person as Darius the Mede. And it couldn't have been someone else who had also had the name of Darius the Mede, because of the person who was king is another character in Daniel.
That's right. And there is a Darius king, but a Persian one, not a Mede, and a bit later. And there's an irony there as well, because that Darius, by the way, the later one that's actually in history, which is not Darius the Mede because he's a Persian one, and a bit later out of time anyway, his son, I forget which way round it is now, but in Daniel, it talks about Darius the Mede's father or son, I think is Xerxes or something. And yet this other Darius, the king, the Persian one, actually is the father or son, I can't remember now, of an Xerxes. So you've even got 2 names together. So the obvious thing is that the writer in the 2nd century of Daniel has just got it confused. He's got the wrong way round. And he's got Darius, who is a Persian, not a Mede. So if you start to then say Darius the Mede was some other sort of hidden figure, then why inspire the scripture to do that when it can get so much right for the 2nd century? Why inspire all these headaches of I think there's another one as well. Nebuchadnezzar's son is called Belshazzar, but in the extra, the people from their own nations, their records say that the father was Nabonidus, not Nebuchadnezzar. And so the problem is that that's just pointing out that the 2nd century authors were a bit hazy about the past, which is obvious from a humanistic, say, point of view. And he's so accurate with Alexander the Great that it must be that he's sitting in that time, and there isn't an inspired chronology of stuff,
Yeah. And there are other ways of dating Daniel using language and that sort of thing. Do you want to talk about that?
There's basically so many like streams of cumulative things that come in here. Like I said, one was the rising of apocalyptic literature was the 2nd century. It's strikingly odd that if you had Daniel written in the 6th century, you've got this 400-year gap where nobody writes anything like it whatsoever. And then boom, in the 2nd century, you get this flowering of literature. That's odd to me. So it could be that Daniel was the first sort of full one written in the 2nd century and then others followed. But apparently Enoch is very similar, and it was a very similar time in the 2nd century. And so that's one way of talking about other ways to look at it, to say that the apocalyptic genre was a 2nd century and onwards scenario, not a 6th century one in that way. That's one. The other, another is the language of there's words in the older part that just are argued to come from this 3rd and 2nd century Greek loanwords, they're called. That it's you wouldn't have had. It's argued you wouldn't have had those words in a 6th century written document. They come about later.
So the Greek words just didn't exist, or weren't
that they just wouldn't have been used. They had their completely own Hebrew words at the time that would have referred. I think there's 3 different instruments that are just like they're commonly used of instruments in the 2nd century, and not in the 6th century. There's arguments like that, and that all goes to support the idea that the further back you go, the hazier you are. So you're getting all of these historical things wrong. And I'm saying,
so there are anachronisms. The writer has fallen into the trap of using words anachronistically.
Yes, it could be a little bit like, there's this letter was written in the 18th century, and someone says the microwave wasn't working this morning.
Yeah.
We would not think. Now, imagine that, trying to defend that from a fundamentalist point of view. Well, you see, a microwave back then meant a sort of a hole in the wall with a fire in it. That's the kind of arguments that are happening. So now there,
and then surely the book would be referred to over those 300 years between.
Another surprising thing, no one mentions it until the Qumran group that was in the I think about 125 BC or something like that, sort of about 50 years. And there's debates around how could a book be written or at least finished in 171 or whatever it was, and then still be almost scripture by the time it gets to Qumran. But apparently, the Book of Enoch was also flowered in that time and was also flying around pretty busily. So, so no one mentions it. Again, no one writes.
I mean,
like Daniel.
Are there other Old Testament books that we do know are well back that aren't mentioned for centuries? And then that would be where the debates go. It's like, okay, so what books are mentioned and what books aren't mentioned, and people would use arguments like that. I have to say that there's an evangelical called, I think I sent you a link, I forget his name already now, Michael Heiser. Now he's a very, very well studied evangelical scholar, and I was surprised that he actually is open to the 2nd century date, to be honest, but he was giving the to and fro responses. Daniel was written in the 6th century as the first apocalyptic, so it's the pioneer. In the 2nd century, they just started to copy it all of a sudden. That's the response, Then the critical view says no, it all flowered in the 2nd century, and Daniel may or may not have been the first. So you can see how debates go, yes.
And then
to me, it's clear that Daniel is a bit of a stitch together. Someone didn't sit down and write Daniel.
Exactly.
It's in 2 languages, isn't it?
It splits into Hebrew and Aramaic. They're related, but it's split. So suddenly, if you're just reading English, you'd never know that whole chapters are in Aramaic all of a sudden, and then back to Hebrew again. I think it's between, and it also splits anyway. If you read it, you've got the first six chapters, which are stories of Daniel in the third person, and then it switches to the first person, very, very different. And that's when it all starts to kick in with the second century stuff. So it's argued by, I would say, some of the experts in Daniel that in fact the stories were oral. Maybe some of them were even written down in certain versions of the first six chapters in the third century, a bit earlier, a bit later. And then they were compiled by someone in the second century and then wrote those sort of last chapters of symbolic prophecies.
Yeah.
And so the idea of Daniel as an idea going back, but again, you don't find much reference to those stories at all, apart from this is just sort of surmising of how those stories would have come about.
Something that struck me when I read it the other day was it was just like actually Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. You can tell that there's two different sources and they've just been pushed together, and the sequence problems wasn't important to the author. And the same thing happens in Daniel 1 and Daniel 2. That the story of Nebuchadnezzar coming to Jerusalem and taking some Daniel and his friends back to Babylon happens then, and it talks about this 3-year training period for Daniel's and his friends. And then chapter 2, it says that Nebuchadnezzar's in his second year of his reign, and Daniel suddenly is an established civil servant, effectively. And so there's a clear problem that just reading it, I suppose with a slightly critical eye, but you don't need to be that on the ball to say, hang on a minute, what's going on here? The sequence all completely up the creek. And so that would be evidence to me that that there were two separate things that got put together that already existed, and either the author, was one way people see this is that the author's full of I don't know what it's called, sort of concern for not tampering with Holy Scripture or whatever. It doesn't want to change the documents. He just puts them together and says, well, shrugs and says, never mind.
So the concern is to this needs to be preserved. The concern is to preserve and not to judge. Yeah.
It might explain also why two of the stories are very similar with the with the visions of the horn, not the horn, the gold and the silver and
the
statue basically themes, that it could have been like, I don't know, I've read that there's sort of two different versions coming down. These are the stories that could have been, they're about Daniel, about this figure, which again, if Daniel wrote them, you would have to say, why did, a bit like the author of Matthew, why not say I this and I that and I did this at those points? Why say, there was this guy Daniel and he was in the lion's den and you're the Daniel writing it? That to me is something that's strange, particularly when he's going into, and then I received a prophecy. He could have then said, well, I was in this, I was in that. So they're like court tales that are being attributed to some ancient person. And that's, again, so common in the second century that you attribute to Enoch, you attribute to all these different people who lived way back in the past. And Daniel, by the way, wasn't found in the prophets in Jewish writings. It was found in a much later catch-all kind of section, which is a hint that it wasn't, it became part of the prophets in terms of how we read it, but it wasn't in terms of the way it found. So that's a real big hint that it was sort of caught late. And so, and there's also, by the way, I don't know if whether you read this, Ed, that prophecy kind of came to an end about 400 years before anyway, the second century. or a bit later than that actually, but there was no more prophets allowed sort of thing. I think they brought an end to it because they're probably all falling out with each other anyway with disagreeing prophecies. And so Daniel, one way to get a prophecy to work would be to cast yourself back before it would be not allowed. Yeah, so you would put yourself back to the 6th century, prophesy for the 2nd century, and you've done it. And that is one argument that's made. How do you do it when there's no more prophecy? Oh, I know. Well, we'll do it by going back to the time when they still were doing it, time of Ezekiel and Jeremiah and stuff, and or near that. And so to me, that makes a lot of sense, to do that. So so that's another point to make.
So can we move on?
Yeah, certainly.
So we've got. Do you feel you've given pretty well all the important points as to why we would conclude that Daniel was written in the 2nd century?
Yes, well, I would like to say compiled, in the sense that those latter portions were written, I would say, in a very short space of time the argument is that Antiochus Epiphanes was predicted to die about, and then he didn't. So it's argued that it was really written around about 167 or 164, sorry. Because that's when everything's so right. So that's that bit. But I think that the authors compiled these more ancient oral, maybe written stories, the first 6 chapters together. And so you've got Daniel kind of compiled and then the last major sections written. That's how I would see it in the 2nd century.
And I think you see it the same way as pretty well everybody except conservative Protestants.
Yeah, conservatives and fundamentalists obviously rail against this because it's a serious challenge to how they've seen the supernatural prediction element. But I think that once somebody realizes that other Christians also see the weight of the 2nd century without thinking about predictive prophecy being challenged, then they can see that they accept. I mean, I don't agree with this, but they accept it as a legitimate genre to do. So they would say that, it's okay to write in someone's name and to do an encouraging piece of apocalyptic literature to the 2nd century audience in the name of Daniel. Whether they knew that or not, I tend to think that they did think it was a real Daniel writing in the 6th century back then, and we've discovered that it wasn't. But that's not what conservatives who accept the 2nd century date would say.
Yeah. So, and do you know what Catholics say about all this?
Catholics and Orthodox, I don't know what they really think about. I would probably say that they loosely hold to the fact that I would imagine Orthodox would say that there was a Daniel that wrote in the 6th century and that they wouldn't take this critical, because Orthodox are actually quite fundamentalist in their own way. But what they don't do is press the end times as such a big thing, that they seem to be open to the fact that we can go on for centuries and that Christ isn't imminently coming back. And they're not an apocalyptic church in the sense that it's all happening. That's really evangelicals, and only some of them. And so they're the ones that really tout the prophecies of Daniel that are still to be fulfilled, and so I think Catholics, if you meet a Catholic and you might even say, what are you talking about? In terms of all of this,
Now, what I'd like to do now is have a quick feel for what actually Daniel's saying.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, the kind of hinge point is this desolation of the temple, which is mentioned 3 times.
Yeah.
And so that's like the hinge. So that there's leading up to that, and then what's predicted after that. Now this is an event, isn't it, in history?
Yes,
desolation
absolutely.
of the temple.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, you've got the first temple going, and then you've got the rebuilding of the second one, and then the ending of the second one eventually. Yeah.
So we start with Nebuchadnezzar, and there's predictions of various accuracy, getting more accurate, of kingdoms coming and going with Persians and maybe Medes and Greeks, and then all leading up to this. The split of Alexander the Great's conquest into the 4 kingdoms.
Yeah.
And then it gets up to this event where somebody desecrates the temple in Jerusalem.
That's right.
Now, what does it predict after that, or is it all so vague?
Well, it's very interesting because, like you said, you've got the real focus of these second section of Daniel in the first person is actually is really focusing on this. A bit more than this, but it kind of gets more detailed in this 10-year period of the mid-second or 171 kind of period of history, and that's the focus. So I think it's really interesting because it's so clear that it's about Alexander and his four sons or whatever going off into different kingdoms. Generals, sorry.
Yeah.
It's so clear about that no one really challenges that it's just too obvious. Nobody goes in and says, well, actually these four things, I don't read them anyway to say that it's something down in our later history, but because it's symbolic and it doesn't actually say Alexander and everything else, you still have sort of wiggle room for exactly who did what when. So it's sort of very accurate, but also there's some loose ends in there. There's no evidence really that Daniel goes to the Roman period in terms of text. There is a clear reference to Greece in that first Nebuchadnezzar interpretation. In the second one, the critical view would say that it's the same thing, that the last big kingdom is Greece. We're talking about Alexander. We're talking about the generals. We're talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, who comes in to do all his bad stuff, who stops the sacrifice in the temple and erects something to Zeus. This is all second century activity. This is all it ever went to in Daniel, because 3.5 years after, well, there's splits on the days, but that's another question. But the 3.5 years basically around this abomination of desolation in the temple of Jerusalem by Antiochus Epiphanes is 3.5 years off of the end of the age, and then there's the resurrection and the end of the age in the Greek period. That was not surprising because everybody who writes does something for their own age. We do it today. It's all happening now. He just cast it back as 6th century and was told to seal it up, but that's just part of the style. It was really in his own age, and it failed, I think.
Yeah. Is it worth? I think it'd be good fun to talk about the weeks now, because that's the most famous prediction of all. All this starts. From my understanding, is that even the Daniel, if he was written in the 5th century, he's scratching his head about the prophecy of Jeremiah that said that the exile would last for 70 years.
Yes. Oh, when you say the 5th century, I think it's 5 something.
Sorry, yes, 6th
it's
century.
The 6th century.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Sorry. The 500s.
Yes,
BC.
That's right. Yes.
And in 539, the exile comes to an end because Cyrus the Great turns up and undoes the decrees, and he lets the Jews in Babylon go home. And that was a bit less than the 70 years that Jeremiah had predicted. So the kind of 70 years become a kind of prophetic 70 years where you've got wriggle room to make it not exact. I think that's how it all starts. And instead of 70 years, it's 7 sevens, and a 7 is a 7-year period. So it's sort of 49 years.
Yeah. That's right.
But that's all
near a jubilee.
You've got to do a bit of interpretation of what weeks means. Weeks means a period of 7, and that's a period of 7 years, not 7 days. And it's all hidden in the language, so it's difficult for us to be clear cut on that.
Yeah. So if I can simplify that a bit, in terms of it's like doing the thing in Daniel, isn't it? After the dream, and then go to another one that makes it simpler. Essentially, what is argued is that Daniel has been reading Jeremiah. Jeremiah had this prophecy saying it's 70 years in Babylon before you all come back and things go right again, basically, things start to get better. And something about Daniel is saying, something didn't happen. Okay, so it was either a partial fulfillment, or it was wrong, or it didn't happen, or it's not going the way we thought. An angel comes to Daniel and says, in essence, says, actually, the 70 years of Daniel is actually 70 times 7. And
you mean
so,
70 years of Jeremiah?
Yeah, so 70 years of Jeremiah is now being reconfigured because the angel was saying basically what Jeremiah didn't know was that it's actually 70 times 7, not 70 years, but 70 weeks of years. So he's still trying to. Now, what does that sound like right off the bat to you, Francis?
It sounds like they're trying to reinterpret.
Yes,
stuff.
exactly. And this has happened even now with people making predictions of the end. You know, when it doesn't happen, again, the common thing is not to say, well, that was all a load of rubbish, or it didn't happen, or it was wrong. No, we understood it wrong. It's always the man that's getting it wrong,
Yeah,
or the human
that
being.
guy. Who's that guy who quite recently predicted
Harold
the end of the world?
Camping.
And then
Yeah.
This is very similar. It happens way back then. And so 70 years, something wasn't really happening. It wasn't the full thing that they were thinking about. And so you've now got 490. So the author is constrained not to say, well, obviously, God, you didn't tell Jeremiah right. He didn't tell Jeremiah 490 years, but the angel is reconfiguring it to 490 years. And then we will see the end, and it will happen in this way. And so that's really what's happening. And so he's been basically meditating on the 70 years and saying, how come, so the angel, here's a really surprising thing. I don't know if you read this, Ed and Francis, if you've ever heard of this, but in Ezra, who interprets Daniel later, actually has an angel come to him and say, now Daniel didn't know this at the time, and goes on to basically imply that it was the Roman period. Okay. And this shows that Ezra interpreted Daniel.
Ezra's a book of the Bible.
Sorry, not Ezra. It was not Ezra in the Bible. Sorry, no, not Enoch. No, it's one of the ones outside. It's one of the ones in the Catholic Bible, but not in the Protestant Bible. I'll have to do a little thing at the end and put that in.
Okay.
I'll find it. Well, actually, I might I'll be able to look it up when one of you two speaks on something, just quickly to correct that. But basically, yes, there's a later interpretation of Daniel who clearly reads it as ending in the Greek period, but is reconfiguring with another angel to make it the Roman period, basically. And that's very interesting because basically Daniel's doing that to Jeremiah. This book does it to Daniel. And I believe Revelation does it to Daniel as well.
Okay.
And so anyway, so that's just a little excursus there to talk about the 70 years. So if you want to carry on then, Ed, on that.
Yeah, so I'll have a go. Now, the weeks, there are 70 weeks, and there's a period of 7 weeks at the start, then 62 or something, I think, and then 7 at the end. And the first 7 is supposed to be the period of the exile. Then you've got this big, massively long period. And then when it all kicks off, and I think in the week's prophecy, you have this anointed one who is cut off. And that in history, people will think is the high priest who was, I think, murdered by the Greek king in about 164-ish BC. And then this 7 years, this final 7 years gets going. And that is when Daniel is predicting the future. So it all goes awry in terms of history matching these predictions. So you've got a week, which is the exile, and then you've got this massive long period of most of the 70 weeks to Androcles, or it was called, killing the high priest, and then you've got the final week. Now, are you back, Andrew?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, I want to talk about what Protestants make of this, but let's finish with what actually in context it's all about.
Yeah, I have got that quote, by the way. It's the Apocalypse of Esdras,
Esdras, right?
Yes, and it talks about, and there's just a bit in there saying, here is the interpretation of your vision. This is to this guy. The eagle you saw rising out of the sea represents the fourth kingdom in the vision seen by your brother Daniel, but he was not given the interpretation which I am now giving you. Okay, so it's happening all again. and this is this guy's putting it into the Roman period. So that I just wanted to include that to go back.
Yeah, I think I want you to rescue me, because in what I was saying, I made it symmetrical, and I know it's not symmetrical. So
the 7.
Yeah, it's not like 7 block, then 7 at the end. It's not that simple.
Well, the 490 years, I mean, yes, it would have been nice for someone to give a prophecy to say the rest of the age is going to be 490 years. This will happen, this will happen, this will happen, and bang, it's the end of the age as we know it. Is that a song, isn't it? I think, yeah. And but it's not as simple as that. It's obviously broken down, as you were mentioning. We've got the 49 years, 462 years, that's right, and then 7 years. So it's broken up into these three. The 490 is broken up into 3 sections, and this makes it complicated in every scenario going, including even the critical scholars. You cannot make it work exactly and nicely as one would like to if you're going to literalize the years. You have to have something going on that makes it fit. It's easier for the critical scholar view to do because you can put the fudging it to the mistake of the 2nd century author who didn't know the background history back to the 6th century. So there's wiggle room there. When you have supernatural God involved in writing it and it still doesn't work, you've then got problems. So that's what I would say about the breakup of the 490 years. Yeah.
This has become the most amazing prophecy that people think that you should become a Christian based on. I first read about it in reading Josh McDowell's famous Evidence That Demands a Verdict. So I was a Christian, had difficulties with my faith. I've told the story way back in an early episode. And so then I kind of put it all kind of aside and said, right, I need to work out for myself what the truth is up here and just follow the evidence where it leads. And of course, I was keen to read apologetics books as well as general academic stuff. And so the most famous apologetics book around at the time was this Evidence Demands a Verdict. And Josh McDowell goes into great detail, and he makes it work that the anointed one will be cut off, which is after the 62 sevens. And he makes that exactly work for about AD 33. And isn't that amazing? And he works it right down to the day. It's so brilliant. And instead of starting at the announcement by Jeremiah to start this 77s and everything, he starts it with the proclamation to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem that Cyrus did in 539-ish. And yeah, that gets you to about 40 AD, 38, 40 AD or something like that. But then he says, okay, but we're using the Jewish number of days in the year, 360, instead of the actual number of days in a year. So that can squeeze it up a bit to get it to 33 AD, which is a bit strange because you would have thought, you noticed that the seasons are kind of going round, and actually the Jews did have a way of kind of leap days and things like that to keep the seasons right. So I think years are years. If you're treating this literally as a time frame, then I think you have to be honest and keep to the about AD 40 if you're going to go for this Cyrus's pronouncement as the starting gun. Anyway, so I was very impressed with this, and I did find it arresting, and the way he got it absolutely to the day by various this and that. I can't remember the detail, and I can't find my book. But at the time, I was completely confused as to, well, if you carry on, you've got this another 7 after that, and so why is the date of this destroying the city and the sanctuary, which is in that exact same passage, why is that wrong by several decades? And I just don't think it sort of addresses it. It just sort of left as to how amazing it is that you got the date of the crucifixion right.
Just to make the point that those predictions themselves are probably not at all in the author's mind, because the figure who comes to do the abomination in the temple is, in fact, is a historically documented thing in multiple sources, that it happened in a very literal sense with Antiochus Epiphanes in that mid-2nd century situation, that he stopped the sacrifice. So the critical view is that, in fact, this guy is the guy being talked about in Daniel, that 3.5 years after that was supposed to be the end in this Greek period, and that it's got nothing to do with going down to the 1st century whatsoever. And so that's how the text is read literally, would be the same figure that does the temple is the same figure who is the Antiochus Epiphanes that's actually referenced by, like I said, that Esdras book. I even mentioned in Matthew, saying back to the abomination of desolation. Obviously, it's been reconfigured in Matthew to happen in the Roman period again in some way, but at least back in Daniel, it is about, nobody denies that it's Antiochus Epiphanes in one level. They just want to see it as a precursor to this Roman period. But that's an interpretation. So the other thing, just like Josh McDowell, there's a critical version of the Josh McDowell thing. If you didn't take the assumption that the 49 years was sequential, that it's a sequential 7 years and a sequential 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and then followed chronologically by 7 years, that actually they are periods in themselves. It's ironic, I'm just putting it out there, but it's ironic that from 605, the beginning of Daniel's speaking about it with Jeremiah, to 171, when the I think it's the Onias, the priest or something, was killed. It's exactly 434 years or something, the 62 weeks, absolutely to the year. And it's like, wow. So if you're going to do the Josh McDowell thing, you can do it that way, as long as you don't see the 7s, 62 and 7s as sequential, that they're concurrent. So that means you can play about with them, basically.
Yeah. So however you take it, either Josh McDowell way or the historian's way or whatever, you still got to do a bit of jiggling about to get the actual thing to hit the nail on the head. For the historian, it's quite easy, because you say, well, the author of Daniel didn't have access to all the historical sources that we have. You could see him making a few mistakes about events in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So it would be remarkable if he did get it spot on, but he gets it near enough. Is that fair, Andrew?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough, and particularly if you can challenge the idea of chronology, and that will make me make another point, by the way, of the leading view about the 7 weeks later. But yes, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Josh McDowell has to do his thing, and pick the event that does the starting gun, which isn't Nebuchadnezzar. It's the decree of Cyrus to make everything a good century and a bit later. Mm-hmm. But then even then he has to sort of tweak things slightly, and then it doesn't. But whatever you do, it doesn't work for the end of the world coming a 7 after either the desecration in the temple or the anointed one being cut off.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I mean, it's just problematic, whichever way you look at it, even if you're pushing it to the first century BC. Yeah.
So Daniel wrote all this, or sorry, the author of Daniel wrote all this. People later tried to say, oh, well, that last 7 is spiritual or something, or did other things to make it fit the Romans and Jesus. And then people like Mark he's not saying anything, but he's hinting, isn't he, that it still applies, but in a different way. I think people are getting more and more vague or creative to make the last 7 work.
Absolutely. And the biggest thing, and this will probably surprise you, Francis, as well, but the biggest and most popular view about this 490 years prediction of the rest of history actually has a pause in it, because it has a separate 7 years at the end. You've got 489, which is not true. You've actually got like I said, you've got 7, 62, and 7, the way it's broken up. But
yeah, so that's what confused me. It's 7, 62, and then 1.
And then, sorry, 7, 62, and 1. Sorry, because we're talking weeks of years.
Yes, and each one is a week, which is 7.
Yeah, that's right. So you got 49 years, 434 years. Then you've got 7 years. I think that's right. To leave it out.
That's right.
That's right. So because it's broken up like that, the most common view in evangelical Protestant sort of more fundamentalist views is that, in fact, because the end didn't happen, there's a pause, and it's been paused even now, so that the 7 years will kick off from the rapture of the church, or the end, when Jesus comes again. Apparently, the 7 years will then start. These last 7 years of Daniel are on pause. Now, from an outsider point of view, Francis, what do you think of that?
Sounds a bit. Well, it sounds a bit convenient. It sounds
It does. I mean, if I said to you, I'm going to meet you in 7 days. Well, actually, technically, I'm going to meet you in 7 days, 6 days plus 1 day, and then I don't come for 20 years. Oh, well, that was the pause between the 6 and the 1. That wouldn't make any sense. Why wouldn't I say the end will come in 2,300 years? On whatever. Why do 490 and then pause the thing with no hint in there about pausing? When something fails, you can't admit that it's a failure, so you reconfigure. And so all these evangelicals are doing is doing what actually the writer of Daniel was doing to Jeremiah 70 years, and on we go. Yeah. And so it doesn't matter what happens in history, you'll just reconfigure and reconfigure and reconfigure. And one day, if something does happen, you go, that was what it was all about. So to me, it's just a failure, reconfiguring. Same with the book of Revelation. So yeah, that's what I'd say about the biggest view of the 7 years. I don't think, Ed, that you sort of grew up, so to speak, with that big pause view, though.
No. I just wasn't interested in this sort of thing.
No.
Imagine you are a Christian.
Yeah.
Maybe you're living in Rome and you hear news of the destruction of the temple.
Yeah.
And maybe was there some desecration that went with it? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, in Daniel, it's already talking about this Antiochus Epiphanes doing the putting the sacrifice to an end and desecrating the temple. Yeah.
Yeah, but when the Romans sacked Jerusalem,
there was
in AD 70. Was there any equivalent?
Yeah, there was a similar thing going on. Yeah.
Okay, imagine you're a Christian in Rome, and you're maybe have later given the name Mark, and you think, oh, this is amazing. How would you try and fit it all together? Because this is what Mark seems to be doing with. My suspicious ears prick up because. Jesus says that the temple will be destroyed, not one stone here will be left on another. And then in the very next verse, very privately, just a few inner circle sanctum disciples ask him, and they all sit down together, and Jesus makes these great prophecies, but not to the people, just to these 4 very private discussion. And it's in that he says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand, is a sort of side note, presumably by Mark, not by Jesus. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains and everything. So Jesus supposedly is using the predictions of Daniel to give some prediction of the sack of Jerusalem and the end of the temple.
Yeah, reconfiguring again the reconfiguring Daniel to apply to that period.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is he doing it in a clever way, or just sort of picking up on it without trying to do any timelines or anything like that?
Well, this comes in between. Is it Mark doing it or Jesus doing it? Because in one sense, Jesus didn't write a word, and so we've only got Mark's. Mark seems to be quite apocalyptic and seeing the end coming in his period, as that book of Ezra's did. About the Roman period, and so it's reconfiguring Daniel, dropping it down to the current state. It's probably not hard to predict that if Romans come in and attack Jerusalem and desecrate the temple, people always desecrated temples and erected things there. I mean, look what they did in the coup in the States. They went in and sort of, in one sense, that's a desolation of the temple of in the States, isn't it, in Washington? And so it's not hard to predict that these things re-happen. And so you could do that anyway, even without supernatural knowledge. I would say, but it's probably written in Mark after the event anyway, a bit like Daniel. And that's why it's all being talked about, because it's happened. And then much more is being probably put into Jesus' mouth. I would say that was probably what's happening with Mark. Yeah. So it's clever and it's reconfiguring, and it hasn't stopped now. So it's still continuing now with Christian people reconfiguring. So
yes, and Jesus doesn't give a timeline except to say the generation will not pass away until all these things have happened.
Exactly. And notice notice the same thing about Daniel, though, that we've got an incredible prediction Mark was written after it all happened, right? And so you've got an incredible prediction of the temple coming down, which it did, and this happening and that happening, and it's so much. And then the colossal non-coming of the Son of Man in the classic sense. And so you've got the same thing as Daniel. You've got an incredible amount happening up to the Temple of Jerusalem being destroyed in Mark, more so in Luke. But then there is no end of the age immediately after, you know,
which is there in the prediction in Mark.
In Mark, that's right.
Yeah, so he says at that time, men will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great.
Yeah, your redemption is nigh, and
that is another reference to Daniel.
Yeah, that's right. And so therefore, again, time passes and shows that you've got accuracy and then failure. And then, of course, the church doesn't accept the failure. So reconfigure, reinterpret, and push Mark or Luke right the way to still happening in our future, ripping it out of context from the first century temple or doing all kinds of gymnastics. Yes. So to me, it's just reconfiguring. And there's a Jewish way of doing it. I mean, it's called pesher, I believe, where you reconfigure for your context in your own time. It's a standard way of reconfiguring. So,
yeah. And that's all Sorry, Francis.
Well, I was just going to say, it's a successful religion will always have a great Darwinian strategy for survival.
Natural selection in prophecy.
Yeah. Well,
right.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because you can look at all of these things outside of the church, like that book called When Prophecy Fails, and shows all of these movements that predict and then fail, predict and then fail, and predict and fail. Nobody denies it. It's just that when it gets too close to the inspired scripture and the same thing is found, that's where obviously you're going to meet an incredible amount of resistance. And why not? Because if you believe it's inspired, it is a threat to you. It's not a threat to me. So I can see what I think I am seeing. So what I'd like to do, though, is just Richard Carrier did a great article on Daniel, and I just wanted to read his summary of the conclusions that he made, which basically forms a great summary for us, I feel.
Okay, great. Yep.
So I'll read this. Okay. So here we go. When we attend to the actual evidence we have to what's most probable, we see there is no evidence attesting to there being a book of Daniel or any specific stories in it in any source prior to the Maccabean era. Red flag, he goes. Earliest reference to Daniel as a person in Ezekiel appears to imagine him as a foreign wise man in a distant mythic time, not as a Jewish prophet, much less of the Persian court, and makes no mention of his writing books, much less of being Ezekiel's contemporary. Red flag. Daniel makes too many mistakes that are impossible for an eyewitness and a leading Babylonian and Persian official as its author is portrayed to be. Red flag. Daniel only produces detailed, correct historical data for the last 10 years of King Antiochus. Red flag. It then gets completely incorrect about everything that happened just before and after his death. Red flag. These coincidences are absurdly improbable on any other theory than that Daniel was written shortly before 164 BC as propaganda promoting an ongoing war and cultural program. And exactly in line with that conclusion, and thus supporting it as evidence, the context of Daniel thoroughly supports the political, cultural interests of the Maccabees at exactly that time. There is no evidence for any other conclusion. Hear. So,
that told them.
That told them. So if you were resisting this, Francis, that told you.
Well, listeners will have noticed fierce resistance being put up by me throughout the whole of the podcast.
Now you'll know if someone tells you, Francis, listen, you have to believe in Jesus because Daniel predicts Christ's crucifixion to the hour. Okay, you've now got some things that you would say to question that.
I will say yes, not so much. But I will have to have this podcast on a loop to remember all the details because it's so complicated.
Yeah, we just quote episode 44. That's right.
Yes. Okay, I remember
and
that.
do it. And so so I am convinced it's a 2nd century compilation. And as Carrier, I couldn't do it any better than what he did. I mean, he summed it up, I think, so well for this 2nd century compilation and writing. So there we go. That's the Book of Daniel for this episode of Doubts Aloud.
Thank you, Andrew. Brilliant.
Yeah, thank you.
So until the next time, and I'm not sure what we're doing next time, we've got no predictions here for sure. Unless we have, Ed. Have we got any predictions?
No. It'll be 4 weeks and half a week or something.
Yes, 3.5 times half a week. Yeah.
Or 30 years, depending on which way you look at it.
Well, yeah, but there's a gap there, you see. So it could be months before we're back. Months and months. Yeah. But it's still all an inaccurate prediction. So there we go.
Totally.
Okay. So, right. So I have, until next time, I have been your host, Andrew.
And I've been Francis.
And I'm Ed.